The senator from Texas.
My colleague from Connecticut just said that they were being tough on China. As I explained, this bill is not being tough on China. But a bit of good news, they will have the opportunity moments from now to in fact be tough on China. I've introduced roughly a dozen separate pieces of legislation designed to do exactly that, to stand up to the Chinese Communist government. And I'm glad also to see my Democratic colleagues discovering the human rights travesties that are playing out in China. Look, my family knows the oppression of communist governments. My father was imprisoned and tortured in Cuba. My aunt, my tia Sonia, was imprisoned and tortured by Fidel Castro's thugs. So when it comes for standing for dissidents, there's a reason why for 8 years I've gone to the Senate floor over and over and over again, speaking up for dissidents that are being tortured and oppressed by communists. And here's a chance for the Democrats to join us in that regard. 2 separate bills that I've introduced that I'm going to discuss. The first, the bill called the Script Act. For years, we have known that China's surveillance state and censorship practices are used to maintain its human rights violations. And what this devastating pandemic has shown us is that China's surveillance state and its censorship practices are also a profound threat to our national security, to our public health, and to our public debate, as the Chinese government hid information about the COVID-19 pandemic that began in Wuhan, China, hid it for months on end and allowed millions across the globe to be threatened, their lives and health and safety to be threatened. And in addition to their espionage activities, the Chinese Communist Party invests billions into spreading propaganda, even using American media outlets, telecommunication infrastructure, movies, and sports teams to spread their propaganda, from buying media outlets so that they broadcast propaganda into America, to coercing Hollywood studios and sports leagues to self-censor by threatening to cut off access to one of the world's largest markets. The Chinese Communist Party spends billions and billions of dollars to mislead Americans about China and to try to shape what we see, what we hear, and think. All of these activities are part of China's whole-of-state approach to amass influence around the world through information warfare. And we need to stand together to stop it. That's why I will be momentarily asking for unanimous consent on the Script Act, which would cut off Hollywood studios from the assistance they currently receive from the U.S. federal government if those studios allow the Chinese Communist government to censor what they're producing. We've seen this pattern over and over and over again, Hollywood being complicit in China's censorship and propaganda in the name of bigger profits. Bohemian Rhapsody, wonderful biopic of Freddie Mercury, story of the band Queen. Well, the Chinese government was upset that Freddie Mercury was homosexual and demanded that Hollywood censor out scenes that showed that Freddie Mercury was homosexual. And Hollywood, those great woke social warriors that they are, compliantly said, we're more interested in the money than in artistic integrity, than in telling Freddie Mercury's story, so the Chinese government will happily edit out those scenes. Doctor Strange, another movie, comic book movie, in Doctor Strange, they changed the Ancient One's character from being from Tibet, which is how it's portrayed in the comic book, to Celtic. Because, the Chinese communist censors, they don't want to recognize Tibet, another area that has been subject to persecution and oppression from China, and Hollywood meekly complied. In the sequel to Top Gun, the back of Maverick's jacket, if you remember the first Top Gun, maybe the greatest Navy recruiting film ever made, the back of Maverick's jacket, you find the Taiwanese flag and the Japanese flag. The Chinese censors didn't like that. And so Hollywood meekly removed the flags. What does it say to the world when Maverick is scared of the Chinese communists? And I would point out, unfortunately, the Chinese censorship is being carried out by Hollywood billionaires who are getting richer in the process. In recent days, it's been reported that one of Joe Biden's top potential choices to be ambassador to China is the former CEO of Disney, who happens to be a major Democratic donor. Disney just came out with the movie Mulan. In the movie Mulan, which the director described as, quote, a love letter to China. Well, this love letter wasn't subtle, because right in the credits at the end of Mulan, they thank the oppressive government forces who are running concentration camps right now with over 1 million Uyghurs imprisoned. Disney gleefully thanked the jackbooted thugs that are carrying out torture and murder, and apparently the leader of that effort is one of the top candidates to be America's ambassador to China. Well, the senator from Illinois, the senator from Connecticut said, we need to stand with people who are oppressed. I agree. Look, Hollywood could say whatever they want, but there's no reason the federal government should facilitate their censorship on behalf of the Chinese communists. And the Script Act simply says if you're going to let the Chinese communists censor your movies, you're not going to get access to the jet planes and to the ships and all the different materiel of the federal government that is used in movies. Moments ago, the senator from Connecticut said they want to be tough on China. Well, we're about to see how tough they are on China. I will happily yield for a question.
Can you tell me, if you were successful and if you hit Hollywood hard, how that provides any solace to the 6,700 Chinese and Hong Kong students in America who are facing the deportation back to prison in China?
Senator from Illinois asked a question. Let me tell you how it provides solace. Because people who are in hellholes, they listen to what we're saying. People who are in hellholes, they hear the voice. You know, some time ago, I had the chance to sit down with Natan Sharansky, the famed Soviet dissident. He and I sat down and visited in Jerusalem. And Natan told me about how when he was in a Soviet gulag, that in the cells, from cell to cell, they would pass notes. Did you hear what Ronald Reagan said? The Soviet Union is an evil empire. Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And I'll tell you how people here, because the senator from Illinois will remember, I introduced legislation to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassly in the United States, Liu Xiaobao Plaza, after Liu Xiaobao, the Nobel Peace Laureate, who was, let me finish answering your question. If you want to propound a second one, I'm happy to answer that one too. Liu Xiaobao was the Nobel Peace Laureate wrongfully imprisoned in China. And the strategy of renaming the street in front of the embassy is a strategy Reagan employed, renaming the street in front of the Soviet embassy Sakharov Plaza. Twice I stood on this floor seeking unanimous consent, and twice a Democrat, the senior senator from California, stood up and objected. And at one point, the senior senator from California said, well, if we do this, it will embarrass the Chinese government. To which I responded, you are understanding correctly, and that's not a bug, it's a feature. That is the purpose. And let me tell you what happened to that. Twice, Democrats objected to the legislation. I then placed a hold on President Obama's nominees to the State Department. And the Obama administration came to me and said, how can we move these nominees forward? How can we move them forward? I said, it's very simple. Pass my legislation and I'll lift the hold. The Democrat caucus didn't like that, but they ultimately agreed. And so the legislation I introduced to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy, Liu Xiaobao Plaza, passed this body unanimously. Now, ultimately, the House didn't take it up and pass it up, but I'll tell you how that story ends. That story ends in 2017 when I was sitting down with Rex Tillerson for breakfast at Foggy Bottom, the new U.S. Secretary of State, and when he spoke to his Chinese counterparts, he said, they have come back and said among their top 3 diplomatic objectives with us is stop your bill to rename the street in front of the embassy. They are terrified by the sunlight and sunshine on the dissidents. At the time, Liu Xiaobo had passed, but his widow, Liu Xia, was still in China, still wrongfully held back. And I told Secretary of State Tillerson, I said, I'll tell you what, you tell the Chinese, if they release Liu Xia, if they let her get out, I'll stop pressing this particular bill. And if they don't, I'll keep pressing it and we'll pass it again because we've already done it. Within weeks, China released Liu Xia. So you ask, how does this help the people in prison? By not having Hollywood media moguls spreading Chinese propaganda. But let me give you a second choice, very directly. You want to know how people are helped? A second bill called the SHAME Act, which, if our Democratic colleagues want to be tough in China, we could pass right now. What does the SHAME Act do? The SHAME Act focuses in particular on human rights atrocities. It focuses on over 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps and other religious minorities and the Falun Gong practitioners who are captured and murdered and whose organs are harvested. And the Chinese Communist Party engages in yet another horror. My Democratic colleagues like to say on the question of abortion they are pro-choice. Well, the Chinese Communist government right now is engaging in forced sterilizations and forced abortions, taking Uyghur mothers and forcing them to abort their children against their wills. Whatever the Democrats' views on abortion in the United States as a matter of a woman's choice, surely they must be united in saying a government forcing a woman to abort her child, to take the life of her unborn child, is an unspeakable atrocity. So the SHAME Act does something very simple. It imposes sanctions on the Chinese Communist government leaders responsible for implementing this horrific 1984-style policy of forced sterilizations and forced abortions. Now, and I had intended to seek unanimous consent for the SHAME Act as well, but my Democratic colleagues have said they're not yet able to find a Democrat to object, although my understanding is they intend to. I hope they reconsider that. A terrific ending for today's debate would be passing the SHAME Act and saying we're all standing together against forced abortions and grotesque human rights violations. Maybe that will happen, maybe it won't. But let's find out where we are on the question of the SCRIPT Act.
Senator from Connecticut.
Reserving the right to object. I think we've gone a little bit far afield from the 6 pro-democracy activists living abroad.
From Connecticut, I had not yet yielded the floor, and I'm about to ask the unanimous consent, so...
The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S. 3835 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that this bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Reserving the right to object on the SCRIPT Act, which I understand is the only measure so far on which the senator from Texas is seeking unanimous consent. Very simply, he knows, I know, we all know, that measure will never reach the president's desk. There's simply no way it can pass both houses of Congress in the next few days before the end of this Congress. The only way we can do something for the freedom fighters and democracy advocates in communist China is to pass this measure that he has objected to, which has unanimously passed the House of Representatives. Only H.R. 8428 offers that opportunity. And frankly, only this measure that he's objected to does anything for the dissidents or the democracy advocates or the freedom fighters directly. He's talking about movies. We're talking about human lives. He can draw all the kind of hypothetical connections between the so-called movie moguls in Hollywood and China, but I think his Scripps Act actually works against the goal that he is advocating. Censorship in China is a legitimate concern, no question about it. And I would welcome the opportunity to work with him on a bill that does something about it. But actually, his bill not only takes away the support for the movies that may be made, it takes away support from documentaries about the repressive regime in China. It takes away classification and other security screening that is necessary for those kinds of movies to be shown in this country. I think that kind of obstacle may be inadvertent on his part, but I welcome the chance to work with him on a bipartisan bill, a truly bipartisan bill that in fact in the next Congress could reach the president's desk. This one that he's offering, the Scripps Act, goes nowhere. But I just want to bring us back to the reality that really is at issue here. Just last Wednesday afternoon of this week, 2 of the activists among the 6 pro-democracy fighters living abroad, charged under China's new national security law, were before our committee. I'm wondering what they are thinking when they hear my colleague from Texas pounding the table about being tough on China, but objecting to a bill that guarantees them protection. As I say, I'm talking about their lives and tens of thousands of others. I'm not talking about movies. I'm not talking about Hollywood moguls. Let's stand up for the lives of those Chinese Hong Kong freedom fighters now in this country seeking protection through a bill passed unanimously by the House of Representatives, the only bill that will go to the president's desk if we approve it. Thank you.
Is there objection? The objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
3 brief observations. Number 1, the senator from Connecticut said multiple times that the House bill in question passed the House unanimously. I am sure this is inadvertent, but what the senator from Connecticut said is simply wrong. It passed the House by voice vote, which is a very different thing from passing unanimously. It simply means the vote tally was not recorded. Secondly, the senator from Connecticut said the Scripps Act is not going to pass this Congress. Well, that appears to be correct, but that is for one reason and one reason only, which is the final 2 words uttered by the senator from Connecticut. I object. Quite literally by doing nothing, quite literally by giving the identical speech he had just given and then closing his mouth before those final 2 words. Had that occurred, the Scripps Act would have passed this body unanimously. So the only reason the Scripps Act isn't passing is because the Senate Democrats are objecting. And it should not be lost on anybody that the Hollywood billionaires who are enriching themselves with this Chinese propaganda are among the biggest political donors to today's Democratic Party in the entire country. Senator from Connecticut said, well, the Script Act might make it possible to have documentaries on the human rights abuses in China. Oh, really? That argument staggers the mind. It so defies reality because you know what? Hollywood doesn't make movies about the human rights abuses in China. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to meet Richard Gere. Now, Richard Gere is not someone you would ordinarily imagine palling around with a conservative Republican from Texas, but Richard Gere was up here. He was up here actually standing up against Chinese abuses and urging anyone who would listen, Republican or Democrat, to stand with him. You know, Richard Gere has not made a single major Hollywood movie in a decade. Why? Because he dared stand with Tibet. And the Hollywood billionaires blackballed Richard Gere. If you speak out for Tibet, if you do what the senator from Connecticut just suggested and discuss the Chinese human rights abuses, it doesn't matter that Richard Gere used to be an A-list Hollywood blockbuster actor. Boom, his career's dead because no studio will produce a movie with him because he spoke the truth. And by the way, my bill presents zero barriers to someone actually making a documentary on the human rights abuses in China because presumably if you're making that documentary, you wouldn't allow the Chinese Communist government to censor it. I don't know what kind of documentaries the senator from Connecticut is familiar with, but I'm not familiar with documentaries done on tyrants in concentration camps where you let the concentration camp guards edit out the stuff they don't like. That ain't a documentary. Senator from Connecticut said perhaps we